When I was in high school, I used to pick coins up off the street all the time. I had a good knack for finding cash. It wasn't the smaller denominations of money, like your 10 yens, 100 yens. No, it was the good stuff, the gold. 500 yen coins. I found about 4 or 5 of them one day. They were just lying there in the road. Usually when you find something, you get a sense that it's been dropped by someone. Like a pack of smokes, a wallet, or a phone. These coins were spaced out over the distance of about 2 kilometers. Plus, the coins were in a straight line. It was almost as if they were leading me somewhere, like the breadcrumbs in Hansel and Gretel. As I was a poor student at the time, I gleefully picked them up. I followed the line of coins from the pedestrian crossing near my house, right down to the nearby river. I'm older now, and if I saw that nowadays, then perhaps I would report it, because it does retrospectively seem a little weird. But as a high school kid, I just thought of the opportunities. I could buy myself a game. I felt like the money was rightfully mine. So I went ahead and picked it all up. The next morning when I woke up, I felt unusually sluggish. Put plainly, I felt awful. My joints ached, my throat was sore, and I was having some trouble breathing. A while after my alarm clock went off, my mother burst into the room looking like a demon. "How long are you going to lie there in bed? Get to school," she said. She was shaking me and trying to make me get up and get ready for school, and then she touched my forehead and told me that I had a fever. She told me off for not telling her sooner. I asked her not to shout because I also had a headache. She left my bedroom and came back with some medicine. Thanks, Mum. I thought to myself at the time, why do mums always become so nice when kids are sick? Why can't they be nicer more often? Thinking back on that makes me laugh. My mum was always nice. I think I was just too young to notice all the things she was doing for me at that age. Anyway, the following 3 days were terrible for me. My fever continued to rise and showed no signs of stopping. I was so sick that I couldn't even hold my water down. My parents were so concerned for me that they took me to a hospital. And as soon as I was in the hospital, my fever went away. It was amazing. The doctor was puzzled and told me that I was okay to go home just after one night. My mum came to pick me up in the morning, and she asked me what I wanted to have for lunch. We were driving to a nearby family restaurant, and then something terrible happened. That was the moment that a car came across into our lane and collided with us head-on. Mum broke 3 ribs. I fractured my right tibia and my right arm. Just as quick as I was out of the hospital, I found myself back in. We also heard that Grandma and Grandpa's house had caught fire. They were both fine, and the fire damage was minimal, but nonetheless it was terrifying. It was a really bad week for us. We were all suffering with some kind of misfortune. My grandma was going on and on about us being cursed. She didn't see the accidents as coincidences. My grandparents are deeply religious, and they went to consult their close friend and local Buddhist priest. When I think back to her saying, it's a curse," in the hospital room, I can't help but smile. Anyway, when I was discharged, Grandma made us go to the temple to see the priest. He did this kind of exorcism thing. After he was finished, he seemed a little indifferent with it all. He walked over to me and asked me if I found anything unusual, or if I was given something recently. And that's when it clicked. He saw my realization and smiled at me, like he knew, and then he explained. "Be careful what you pick up. A long time ago, people would intentionally drop things on the street to get rid of negative attachments and evil spirits. It could be cursed objects too, like money, rings, whatever. The idea was that person who disposes of the object passes on their bad luck to the person who picks it up. It's like the item brings about misfortune to the scapegoat who takes it home. In this case, I'm guessing that's you." With that, the priest left us. I never believed in the supernatural or the paranormal until that day, but there was something convincing about the priest and all that happened to me and my family. It taught me to try and open my mind to otherworldly possibilities. I returned later with the coins and gave them to the priest for him to purify. Now that I'm an adult, I just want to end on one more experience here. I saw a diamond ring outside my workplace recently. It was so obviously placed in the middle of the street. anyone would have noticed it. I felt like it was left there intentionally, and I didn't dare pick it up. This happened a long time ago, when I was in junior high school. I had just finished my classes for the day, and I was walking home with a good friend of mine. It was a warm day in our coastal town. By the way, I live by the sea. So my friend and I were walking along chatting as usual, when a woman dressed in black approached. She looked to be in her 40s. She was tall and thin, and she was wearing a big black hat too. She wasn't mourning or anything. She just looked a little weird, I guess. "How close is the sea?" she asked. She asked it in such a dull voice and stood in our path in an alley, stood stock still. She asked me, so I told her. The route to the beach was a little complex from where we were, so I explained it the best I could. She thanked my friend and me, and then she left. I spoke with my friend, and we were a little surprised that she wanted to go to the beach at that time of day. The sun was setting. There wasn't much to do there anyway. It wasn't a tourist beach. I realized that it was a bit of a one-sided conversation I was having with my friend, so I asked him what was up. He said, "Man, she really creeped me out." After that, we walked home in silence. He was right though, there was something a little off about that woman. She seemed to be in a daze. Maybe she was overtired or something. After me and my friend parted ways, I kept on thinking about the woman, but by the time I got home, I forgot about her. That night, I got a call from my friend, and even though we are really good friends, he never called me, nor I him. In fact, it was the first time he called me. My dad called me from the bottom of the stairs. We didn't have mobile phones back then, we had house phones. And as soon as I put the phone to my ear, he said, "Remember that woman we met today, who asked how close the sea was?" "Yeah." "Her body was found in the sea." "You're kidding." It was really weird. I felt a strange sense of panic about the situation, and I don't know why I felt like that. Panic was followed by a sense of creepiness that I cannot describe. I then asked about how he knew that, and he said it was his brother who discovered the body. Well, he said his older brother was called by one of his friends who found the body, and then that friend asked his older brother if he wanted to go see, and he did. But by the time they got there were a bunch of rubberneckers gawking at the scene. The police followed shortly after and cordoned off the area. If the police and the others didn't find the body, would I have gone to take a look? I'm not sure. Maybe, but probably not. I don't think I'd be able to get the image of a woman in black motionlessly floating in the sea out of my head if I did anyway. Later, I read about the incident in the paper. Well, I didn't really need to read about it. The story of the body in the water was on every pair of lips in our little seaside town. The cause of death wasn't suspicious. She took her own life. Now, the scary point about this story is the following. When we met that woman, we didn't know that we were face to face with a killer in that alley. She headed for the beach after she killed her husband. The manner of killing is not something I really can go into, because not all the details were released by the authorities, but I'm guessing that it was kind of gruesome. To think that we were probably the last people she saw before she ended things. The outcome could have been very different, I guess. I wonder what might have happened if we said something wrong, maybe annoyed her or something. She could have reacted. I don't want to think about what kind of reaction that might have been, though. The incident occurred in 1991 or 1992. I don't remember the time of year that well, but like I say, it was kind of hot, maybe between summer and autumn. The article should have been in either the Yomiuri Shimbun or the Kanagawa Shimbun. I think about it often. It was real traumatic for me. Thinking back on it makes me shudder. I talked to a killer. I have 2 cats at home. They're both crossbreeds. One of them has helped me twice when I really needed it, and therefore I call that one Cat God. I want to share my experiences with you. One Sunday afternoon, I was attacked on the way home. Well, I guess almost attacked would be a better way to say it. It happened when I was on my way home from a convenience store. I headed there to get a little late breakfast. Out of nowhere, a dog came barreling towards me. He came bounding over. I knew it wasn't a stray dog because he had a collar around his neck. It was someone's pet who was running wild. It was a Doberman. Its eyes were on me and it began to growl. It growled a low guttural growl and bared its drool-covered teeth. It took up a stance and started barking at me, and then it lowered its body as if it intended to pounce. It was ready to attack. It was horrible. I didn't do anything to provoke this dog. It was just pure evil in my eyes. It wanted to attack me. The fight or flight debate came to the forefront of my mind. I decided very quickly that it would be near impossible to outrun a Doberman, so I figured my only shot at not getting torn to shreds would be to kick it when it lunged at me. The dog lowered itself further, as if it was bracing itself to jump, and in that moment, something fell from above and landed on the dog's face. The dog immediately started whining and attempting to shake, but it was no good. My cat, aka Cat God, was on the dog, and he was scratching and biting it. Eventually the dog shook Cat God free, and then ran off, and it looked like Cat God got a few good scratches in there. Cat God then sat there, in the road, licking his paw, like nothing happened. The strange thing about this is, I swear I shut the cat in when I left for the store. I have no idea how the hell he got out. Thinking back on it, I guess Cat God jumped from a limb of a tree or a high wall. I was amazed at my cat's courage, and genuinely grateful. So that night, after I gave him a bath, I treated him to the most expensive food I could buy at the store. He deserved it, and since he was used to dry food, I imagine it was a real treat for him. Fast forward a few months and I'm preparing for a business trip. I would be going very far. My colleague offered to drive, and I was fine with that. As I was getting ready in the morning, Cat God was clinging to my feet. I ignored him, and I carried on with my preparations. He went off and then climbed on top of the wardrobe. I reached into the wardrobe to grab my bag, and the goddamn Cat God jumped on my back and clung around my neck. I got him off me and dumped him on my bed and carried on getting ready. He stood there on the bed with his hair on end and his back arched, hissing at me. I was like, whatever, Cat God, I'm out. The second I put my hand on the door handle, he raced over and started scratching me. The scratches were strong enough to draw blood. I didn't know what the hell had gotten into him. The wounds I suffered were worse than I first thought. I had to get a doctor to look at it. There was no way I could sit in my colleague's car bleeding profusely for 4 to 5 hours. I went to a nearby hospital and called my co-worker and apologized and said that I would take the train instead of keeping him waiting. Thankfully, if I didn't spend much time in the hospital, I would still make it on time. I was cursing my cat. He really wrecked things that morning. As I was leaving the hospital, my phone was ringing. It was my colleague. He told me that he had gotten into a high-speed accident. He was completely fine, there wasn't a scratch on him, unlike me. He was just calling to see if I would still make it on time because he wasn't sure he was going to be on time. By the time night rolled around and the business meetings were over, I had a chance to speak with my boss off the record. The first thing he said to me was, "I'm real glad you didn't get in that car." I asked him why, and he told me that the accident my co-worker got into pretty much crushed the entire passenger side of the car. Had I been in that car, I would have either died or been seriously injured. I began to put 2 and 2 together, and I came to the conclusion that the scratches from Cat God weren't coincidental. I mean, he's never scratched me before. It was weird. I couldn't be sure, but I wanted to show my appreciation to Cat God. So I made sure that on the way home, I picked him up some really special cat food for dinner. I was safe from harm, thanks to my cat. Twice. It's amazing. A theme park in my hometown closed down. It wasn't a big park. It didn't have that many attractions. It had a Ferris wheel and some other stuff. I never got to go while it was open. I've only known it as abandoned. I'm not sure why it wasn't demolished. Maybe there was no interested buyers. You could see the Ferris wheel from outside the grounds. It was rusted, and it made a squeaking noise when it slightly moved on windy days. It gave the park a creepy vibe. It's famous in my hometown as being a ghost hunting location. Everyone speaks about how haunted it is. People come from far away just to take a look. I think it's been abandoned for about 10 years. Anyway, it was still abandoned when I ended up leaving my hometown. I went off to study at university. One night at uni, a friend and I were kind of bored. I don't remember how it came up in conversation, but we decided to go somewhere haunted. On a ghost hunt. A friend of ours had a car, so we shot him a message to see if he wanted to come, and he did. So the three of us, me, my friend, we will call K, he wasn't scared of ghosts and he's the one with the car, and my other friend, we will call S. He's a kind of goofy guy who likes to joke and mess around a lot. So we sat in S's car, and we were having a little discussion about where we wanted to go. We were talking about haunted tunnels, high bridges, and urban exploration places, but we couldn't agree on a location. I remembered the abandoned theme park in my hometown, and since it was only about an hour away, we decided to go for it. We arrived and parked a little away, not to attract any unwanted attention. It was about 1 a.m. when we first set foot in the abandoned theme park. I had no idea that it would be the worst night of my life. We walked around the grounds, looking at all the rusted and decaying rides and amusements. It was creepy, but I didn't get paranormal vibes. I didn't sense the presence of spirits. It just seemed very ordinary. I took a couple of photos to see if anything like orbs would appear, but there wasn't anything. It was fun either way, though. We were about to go home, but one of my friends found a kind of office at the top of a hill. K and S wanted to see if there was anything interesting in there. The atmosphere felt a little different. It went from ghost hunting to looking through stuff. It felt a little wrong, but we carried on anyway. From the outside, the office looked well maintained and tidy. It looked out of place. For a little office that had been abandoned for over 10 years, I expected it to look worse. I wondered if we stumbled into a homeless person's refuge. We were way out in the mountains, so that didn't seem plausible. The office just seemed a little weird. It was locked, so we couldn't get in anyway. We didn't see any windows we could crawl through, either. The door to the office had a numbered lock on it. We should have given up at that point and gone home, but we persisted. Kay was saying how in situations like this, the person who locked it only moves one of the numbers by 1 digit. So he picked up the lock and moved the last digit, and we couldn't believe it. The lock opened. There was a debate between my friends. S wanted to go home, but Kay was excited to see what was in there. So after a few minutes of deliberation, we went inside. The first thing that struck me was the undeniable evidence that people had been in there recently. There was a little oil heater in there, and an empty cup ramen. Because there was an oil heater, I tried hitting the lights, and to our surprise, they came on. I wondered if a manager or some kind of security guard was using this room. I turned the lights off. I didn't want to attract attention. I realized now that we had gone past ghost hunting, and we were now trespassing. I didn't want to be the first to say let's go home, so I kept quiet. I wish I didn't, though. Kay was searching around the place, opening drawers and lockers. He was obsessed with finding something, anything. We asked S to guard the entrance. Kay opened a desk drawer and pulled out a gun. Things were getting serious. I noticed there was a sword in the corner of the room too. It was a katana. I couldn't be sure if it was a fake sword, and if the gun was just an air gun, but it wasn't good. Kay then noticed there was some kind of underfloor storage. He He was adamant that there would be something good hidden down there, so he went about trying to gain access, and after a minute or two, he was successful. We opened the underfloor storage and discovered bags of white powder. There were loads of them. Just at the moment our minds comprehended what we were looking at, we heard S scream from outside. The lights came on, and he was being pushed into the room, and his nose had been bloodied. There were a few guys holding him by his arms. And then this skinhead, who appeared to be the boss or leader of the others, walked into the room and started to ask us questions. "Who'd you guys work for? What are you doing in here looking for our stuff? Looking for money or looking to die tonight, boys?" I replied, No, it's just a misunderstanding. We were just urban exploring, ghost hunting. We didn't mean to. I mean, we really didn't do... I'm just really sorry." "Right. Then why are you in here? Clearly know how to unlock the door." "No, we just, moved the combination lock by just a digit. It was just a one-off. We shouldn't have done it. I'm sorry, we'll just go." "You expect me to believe that? You're coming with me for a drive." We were tied up, shoved into a car, and driven for about an hour. I don't think I have the words to explain how frightening that was. We were just dumb students, and we were abducted by these scary men. We arrived at an abandoned-looking warehouse in the middle of the mountainous woods. We were tied to chairs, side by side, and then the torture began. We were asked questions we couldn't possibly answer. I was asked first, "What were you going to do after you cleared that office of our stock?" He was referring to those bags of white powder. I could only answer with the truth, so I said we were just urban exploring. The skinhead then removed one of my toenails. The question was asked again. I gave the only answer I could, and another toenail was removed. I think he believed me when he removed my last toenail. The only word I have for you is agony. It was hell. S pretty much fainted after his second one was removed. K kept the most positive, and he just kept talking and talking to the skinhead, trying to convince him of our innocence. It seemed to do nothing but annoy the skinhead, who clearly was part of some gang or organized crime. I don't know how many times K was hit in the stomach, but it was a horrific amount. Every second felt like a minute, and every minute felt like an hour. Things were looking incredibly dark for us, but then the torture ended. We were finally able to prove ourselves trustworthy in the skinhead's eyes, and we were untied. I don't know how we did it, as it seemed like we would never be able to convince him. Our driver's licenses were copied, and we were forced to give them our home addresses. He said that if anything happened to their stock in the abandoned theme park, we would be the first people he blamed. The first people he would come for. I sensed that we were about to be freed, but the rug was pulled out from under us. Kay's second name evoked some memory in one of the gangsters. Apparently Kay's older brother was known to these guys, and they didn't like him. It wasn't possible. Kay was from a completely different area in the country, nowhere near my hometown. Kay's torture resumed. They were screaming things at him like, "Did you come here under your brother's orders?" Kay's surname is really rare, so they were certain he was part of some kind of rival gang called the Half Greys. This couldn't be further from the truth. In the end, S and I were thrown from a car about halfway down the mountain pass, and Kay was left with him in the warehouse. Since it was my hometown, I had my dad pick S and I up, and he drove us back to S's car. We couldn't go to the police. They would have done something terrible to our families. We were so helpless. I hid my injuries from my parents, and just said that my friend and I got lost. I felt so ashamed that I couldn't tell them, but it was for their own safety. We weren't able to contact Kay after that night. We looked for him at uni, but we didn't see him. I was so worried about him. I didn't know what to do. After a few months, S said to me that he had seen him at uni. Thank God he was still alive, was my first thought. S then told me that K was using a wheelchair, and he was being pushed along by someone who looked as if she could be his mother. She apparently scowled at S when she saw him. This is all relatively fresh. I don't know what will happen, but I think K isn't talking to me, and I can't blame him. It was my dumb idea to go to that abandoned theme park. The reason that place isn't demolished must be something to do with those gangsters. I'm sure of it. Don't go urban exploring. Sometimes there are worse things than haunted buildings. When I was in elementary school, I joined a camping trip for 2 nights hosted by the school during summer vacation. The campsite was about 2 hours from the nearest town. It was a proper camping trip. Even though it was technically a campsite, it wasn't very well maintained. There was a kitchen and a bathroom, and that was good because at least it wasn't just the tents, you know? But the place wasn't in great shape. Everything was dated and kind of shabby. The toilet was more of an outhouse, to be honest. It was way out in a field. The campsite was really close to some swampland, and on the other side was a cliff. Even as a kid, I remember thinking, this is a really unsafe place to camp. We had plenty of activities available, such as hiking and fishing in the day, and campfire and doing dares at night. On the first night I was there, I took up one of these dares. I thought it would be a simple dare, but it was different to the ones I did that age. We call them tests of courage, and you know, they're not usually this intense. This was a dare that was created by the teachers, by the way. And it went like this. Go into the woods at night without a flashlight alone and stay there for a while. There were rules to this dare too. If you start running or you scream, you'll alert the wild animals and become one of the kids who go missing around here. This is what the teachers said. I can understand that they were trying to make it fun for us, and I'm pretty sure that we were perfectly safe, but looking back on it, I guess that was kind of strange. We were told to stand there, in the woods, with no light, in complete darkness, and in complete silence, until one of the teachers came back to get us. Even though I didn't really want to do this, I went along with it. I was somewhere far from home and far from civilization in the mountains. I was a pretty obedient kid. So I walked with the teachers and their flashlights out into the middle of the woods. It was so dark, and all I could hear was the sound of insects and the slow sigh of the trees. We got to where I guess was the designated spot, and the teachers' flashlights went off, and I heard them trudge away over broken branches and through thickets of weeds and bush. When that flashlight went off, there was nothing but darkness all around. There should have been other kids close by doing the dare with me, but I couldn't hear anyone else. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or if they were closed. It was that dark. The air was acrid and warm. It seemed to cling to my skin. I heard the occasional rustle of bushes and the call of the wild. Some unknown animal was barking in the distance. I hoped that it was the distance. It was hard to say if it was near or far. I guess in reality, I was only out there for a few moments. No longer than 5 minutes at tops, I guess. But those moments felt so long. It was so isolating. I felt completely alone in the world. Then the flashlights came out of nowhere and came straight towards me. I was relieved that they were back and I wasn't alone anymore. We all headed back to the campsite together. Our teachers were saying, "Oh, we're all lucky that we didn't see anything creepy this year." We were joking, and I guess I felt kind of brave and mature. It was good. The rest of the night was pretty uneventful, to be honest. The next day, I noticed that my friend who did the dare around the same time as I did was looking awfully frightened. She was looking towards the cliffs, and when I asked what happened, she just replied, "Can't you see them?" I looked at her puzzled. "Come take a look." She took me to the edge of the field towards the cliffs. "Look down there." I looked down there and I couldn't see what she was talking about. There was nothing but a flowing stream down below. But my friend looked like she was on the verge of tears. "The kids with red faces down there, can't you see them?" She said that she could see a girl and a boy that I couldn't. She was shouting and crying. It clearly had upset her. Soon after, the teachers came over to see what all the fuss was about and to try and console her, but just like me, they couldn't see what she was talking about. I was worried about my friend, but life on the campsite carried on, and as you know, kids have short memories and attention spans. I guess we all got distracted and forgot about it. Later that night, I was really tired, but a lot of the other kids were still awake and still lively. I was snug in my sleeping bag and on the verge of sleep. I heard them whispering excitedly and happily in the glow of the lamplight. And just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard the tone of the kids around me shift. Excitement gave way for tension, and I heard them whisper, "Are you okay? Wait, let me go get the teacher." I popped my head out of the sleeping bag and I saw two girls leaning over another girl sat on the floor leaning forward. The girl on the floor was complaining of pain. "It hurts. It's so heavy. Help me," she said. She was complaining of feeling crushed, and right before our eyes, she folded. Her chin was nearly touching the floor. It was as if something heavy was on her back. She cried and she screamed, and everyone in the tent was panicked. It was one of those huge outdoor tents, by the way. Everything was happening so fast. It was so stressful. Everyone was so frightened. I never heard screaming like that before. The teachers came rushing in, and one had a bottle of salt in their hand. He sprinkled it everywhere and started hitting the girl in the back with his palm, and miraculously, the girl stopped crying and screaming. She was up on her feet like nothing had happened. After that, nothing else of note really happened. We went home without issue. On the bus home, I spoke with some of my friends and other groups of kids I weren't friendly with about what happened. Some kids had different experiences. One said that when they went to the outhouse at night, there was a kid they didn't know stood stock still, staring at them. Another kid said that they saw shadows everywhere they looked, humanoid shadows. I was really surprised that there were more experiences. The mountains are a truly unusual place. My friend who saw those kids with the red faces has been kind of mountain phobic since that trip. I can't even remember why I wanted to go on that trip. It feels like some vague half memory, like it was some liminal space. About 10 or so years ago, I moved into a quiet residential area. I was really excited to live there. The neighborhood looked perfect. It looked like something out of a wholesome made-for-daytime TV movie. And the neighbors were all so nice. They came to greet me as I was unloading boxes from the moving truck. They said things like, "If you need anything, all you gotta do is ask." My partner and I were really happy there for about 5 years or so. The happiness ended when I found out that my partner was cheating on me. She divorced me and moved out and in with her new man. We didn't have kids, but I foolishly put the mortgage solely in my name, and she wasn't interested in how much financial pressure she put me under. I had no choice but to live alone. As a couple, we had participated often in community events and festivals, but since she left, I didn't feel like going to any events anymore. I guess that I didn't want to see the sympathetic looks and hear the probing questions. Plus, in order to keep a roof over my head, I needed to work more. I barely had a moment to myself, let alone time for neighborhood events. One day I decided to formally resign from the community association, and as soon as I did that, something changed in the neighborhood. The atmosphere had shifted. After I left the community association, everyone in the neighborhood began to ignore me. I would say hello to the family across the street, but they would pretend like they didn't hear or see me. I didn't get it because the guy was really nice, and I thought that we got on well whenever we spoke. He was the kind of guy to speak about anything. It was as if his tongue was scared of the dark. I remember one time he spoke to me for about 10 minutes about his garbage, so this was highly unusual. It wasn't just him and his family, it was everyone. All my neighbors were pretending like I didn't exist. It was clear that I was being targeted. I guess that they must have felt as if they were really upsetting me, but to be honest, they weren't. I was fine with not having to speak to them. People who ignore others like that are incredibly narrow-minded in my opinion, so why would I want them as acquaintances? However, my indifference to their stupid ignoring game only served to irritate them. They ramped up their targeting behavior. Thinking back on it, maybe I should have tried to make amends, but I don't think it would have made much difference. The harassment began as a direct response to my ignoring of them. I woke up one morning to find trash all over my lawn. It was as if it had been deliberately thrown there. I didn't see who did it, so I couldn't be sure it was one of my neighbors. It could have just as easily been a cat or a crow, but I had my suspicions. I cleaned it up and kept my suspicions to myself, for the time being. But then something else happened. The garbage I threw out in the communal garbage area was put back in my garbage can. I knew that this couldn't be the work of animals. Not wanting to make an issue out of it, I just put the same bag back out again and went out to work. When I came home, I found that it had been returned back to my garbage can once again. If it was a one-off, I could have understood it, but it wasn't. It happened time and time again. I decided to install some home surveillance cameras. I hoped that this would help me monitor what was going on while I was at work. However, as soon as the cameras were up, the harassment stopped. I had no evidence. It was a nice place to live, and if this was all they had to irritate me with, and a camera stopped it, then I thought, hey, I don't need to worry. I didn't have to talk to my neighbors anymore. I didn't need to sponsor their kids' run or waste my weekends with small talk around the barbecue. For me, it felt like a win. But then the silent calls came. Someone kept calling my home phone, and whenever I picked it up, they said nothing. So I disconnected the phone line. I used my mobile phone more anyways, so I kind of made a saving. When my home phone number was out of service, I started getting the calls on my mobile. It didn't seem as if it was going to end. This went on for a long time. I felt so exhausted by it all. I know that it all sounds relatively minor, but if you put yourself in my shoes, you would see what I mean. Imagine everyone in the neighborhood ignoring you, and then trying to find a new way to mess with you at every opportunity they could. They did other things that I don't even want to repeat. Enough was enough. As nice as the area was, it wasn't worth all of this, I thought. I found a new place to live, and after a while, I was able to carve out a situation where I was able to leave, so I decided to move. On moving day, all the neighbors crowded around to watch me stack boxes in the rental van. They stood there silently, grinning, enjoying what they had done. I hated that, so I had to speak up. I had to get something off my chest. What the hell is wrong with you people? I shouted at them. Look, when you join the community association, you don't leave it. People who break the rules of the community don't belong here. So, what do you want from us? We're glad you're leaving. This is a family community. And you don't fit the bill anymore, do you? My neighbor across the street said. I had no words. It was like a cult. And it was all I could do not to haul off and hit the guy. And rules? What rules? Oh, so sorry guys, my wife left me. Please give me another chance to live in your creepy society. What a bunch of cruel-hearted people I unfortunately used to call my neighbors. That experience taught me to thoroughly investigate and research the area I choose to live in. I'm doing much better now. This happened about 20 years ago, in the early 2000s. I was working in the service industry at the time. I was traveling home from work, on the train as usual. It must have been at around 9 p.m. when I got off at my local station and started walking home. I called my friend on the walk home. It was something I often did. We called all the time, and we never really got bored of conversation. While I was on my way home, as the conversation was flowing, my phone's low battery notification went off. My phone was old at the time, and I knew that as soon as I got that notification, I had about 5 minutes to get to a charger before it died. I was far from home, but I really wanted to carry on talking with my friend. The gossip was too good. I should have gone home and just put my phone on charge, but I decided to duck into a phone booth and call her before my phone cut out. After a while, I realized I was getting kind of low on money, which was just as well, as the conversation had fizzled out a little and was heading to a natural conclusion. After saying bye to my friend, I hung up and turned to exit the phone booth. On the other side of the glass door, I saw a middle-aged man wearing a jersey, sat astride a bicycle. He was so close to the phone booth, it seemed as if he had been there for a while. I assumed that he was waiting for me to finish my call, so he could use the payphone. I said something like, "Sorry if you were waiting for a long time for the phone." However, the man didn't appear that interested in the phone. He didn't go into the booth, he just slowly started to follow me, at a distance. I thought to myself, well, I guess he could be heading my way home. I didn't really feel comfortable though, so I headed into a nearby convenience store. I used the bathroom and I bought a couple of bits and pieces I needed for home. I was in there for about 10 minutes and then I left. As soon as I left the store, my eyes were drawn to a familiar figure sat atop a bicycle. The man was still in the area, and he appeared to be waiting for me. I didn't see him through the convenience store's windows, as he stood slightly out of view. I was getting seriously weird vibes from him at this point. I started walking home, and once again he started following me at a distance. I didn't want him to know where I lived, so I ran for it. I knew that there was a police station not too far from the convenience store, so I headed there. There was an officer on duty. I told him that a man was following me. He said that he couldn't intervene unless direct harm had been caused. Basically, he wouldn't do anything until something happened. He was completely unhelpful. I turned my back on that officer and went to storm out, when once again someone caught my eye. The man was there. He was staring at me from across the street. I spun around and appealed to the officer. I said, "There he is, he's right there." His radio sparked to life. He spoke with someone and then said to me, "I've just received an urgent report. I'm gonna have to leave right away. Look, leave your address, name, phone number, and any other details here, and I'll make sure someone patrols your neighborhood later, okay? It's the best I can do for you right now. You should just go home, stay safe." I was at a loss for words, but since it was almost 11 p.m. and I was on my way home, I decided to keep going. I looked towards the man, and he looked really pleased with himself. He didn't seem deterred. He didn't seem worried that I had just come out of a police station. He seemed to know exactly what the outcome would be, and he seemed pretty happy about it. All I hope is that policing has improved over the last 20 years. I started to walk home. I didn't have many other viable options. From the police station to my place, it wasn't that far. The man followed me. He was shouting something now. I tried to walk as fast as I could and ignore him, but he was clearly yelling something towards me. I didn't think he was drunk, but I couldn't make out what he was shouting. Well, it was getting a little much. I decided that I didn't want to go home anymore. I don't know why I let that cop tell me it was a good option. I figured that my next best course of action would be to call my parents' house and see if anyone there could come and pick me up. One problem though. My phone's out of battery. I knew that there was another phone booth nearby though. The only issue being the fact that the phone booth was in a park. And that park was dark and creepy at night. I didn't know if I could handle being in there with this guy following me. All of the houses that back onto the park did give me some comfort, but if the people in those houses were as indifferent as the officer was, then would it be a good idea? Either way, I was without a phone, and I needed to fix that, so I decided to head into the park. I ran as fast as I could to the phone booth. I dialed and waited for my parents to answer. I was sweating, not just from the run, but I was sweating through fear. I was praying for someone to pick up the phone, but I knew my parents must have already gone to bed. I don't know how many times the phone must have rang, but after what felt like forever, I heard someone answer the phone. Just at that point, I saw the man approaching the phone booth, and he tried to open the door. I was desperately pleading with my mum for help, while simultaneously trying to keep the man out of the phone booth. He was trying his best to force his way in, but I leaned my weight against the frame of the door, and it seemed to hold him off. I told my mum to get here as soon as possible. One great feature of the Japanese payphone is the red button. It's a little hard to describe, so here's a photo of one. Basically, if you hit the button, you will alert the services in your area to come to the phone booth's location and offer assistance. All you had to do was press that red button, pick up the receiver, and wait for a connection. The man saw that I had done this, and I'm certain he knew what pressing that button meant. This next part is gross, so please skip if you don't want to hear it. He pulled the jersey he was wearing down past his knees and exposed himself. Pressed the lower half of his body against the glass in the phone booth and smiled. A chill ran through me. It was nightmarish. While that was going on, I had to explain to another officer what was the purpose of my call. I almost broke down. They said, "Stay there until police arrive." It wasn't like I could go anywhere else. When I hung up, I saw headlights of a car pull into the park. I knew that car. It was my mum's. The man seemed to sense the danger and made a break for it. He rode off on his bicycle, yelling and shouting in the same manner he had done before. That's where my interactions with that creep ended. The incident made me wonder if he was just some kind of mad exhibitionist, or did he have something worse on his mind if he managed to get in that phone booth or follow me home? I don't know. Something tells me it's the latter. I'm not sure if I want to know anyway. It was such a scary experience. I'm gonna keep the details of where this happened private, out of respect to the people who still live there, in that building. I feel for those people. This happened about 3 years ago. I was asked to help plan a new retirement home. The location of the retirement home would be in the city next to the one I was living in. At the time I was asked, I was working in a different city, a long way away from where I was living, and driving to and from work took up a lot of my free time. So to work in the next city over seemed like a smart idea. I accepted. I was asked to attend a planning meeting at the site, so I drove to the location. It was only about a 15-minute drive from my place. The location was amazing, but there was one thing that was a little odd. It was only 300 meters or so from a large cemetery. So I imagined that whoever lived in that retirement home, in an apartment which faced the cemetery, wouldn't have the best of views. Plus, they would have the constant reminder that death is just around the corner, literally. Maybe that's just me being morbid, but there was literally nothing else nearby the proposed retirement home site. The meeting went well, and I was excited to get to work. Before leaving, I saw an older man passing by. He seemed to be interested in our meeting. I decided to go over and say hi. I asked him if he was out on a walk, and he shook his head to indicate no, and then he asked me, "What will be built here?" I told him that a retirement home would be built here, and then I pointed out the coming soon signs that were being set up. The old man then said, "I thought this place would be a nice and quiet place to spend the rest of my life." And when I heard that, I felt as if he could have been being a little sarcastic, so I replied with something along the lines of, "Well, it might not be the best location on Earth." He kind of faked a laugh and then walked off. Planning was complete, and the date of digging the foundations had approached. There were 2 workers there when I arrived at the site, and it was as if they had been waiting for my arrival. I knew one of them, but I didn't know the other. We greeted one another, and the guy I hadn't met before looked a little nervous. After a brief discussion, we began the excavations. We had been excavating the ground for about 3 hours until the excavator suddenly stopped. The driver got out and went to inspect. I was curious too, so I kept a watchful eye on him. I found out that the caterpillar tread had stopped working, rendering the machine static. The driver got out and went to check, and as he was passing under the bucket, it dropped on top of him. The sound of impact was horrifying. The bucket should have been static and incapable of falling like that, but it did. I shouted to the other nearby operator to pull up the bucket as I raced over. Luckily, the operator only suffered some deep bruising to his left arm. He was putting on a brave face, and to me it appeared as if he was hiding the extent of his pain, so I insisted that he got his arm looked at. He said the reason that he got out of the excavator so quickly was because he thought he saw the shadow of a person heading towards the excavation site. But when he was beneath the bucket, it was as if the person he thought he had seen vanished into thin air. He was apologizing over and over again and telling me how crazy it sounded. I told him that there was no need to apologize, and we went to the hospital together. Once he was x-rayed and no fractures or breaks in his arm were discovered, we headed back to site. He wanted to come back with me. When we got back to site, we saw that work appeared to have stopped. I went over and asked what the holdup was. I was informed that the excavation continued in the area the accident took place in until something was discovered. I looked towards the area he pointed at, and I saw something that looked to me like an old pot lying on the fresh dark soil. "What's that?" I asked. "We're pretty sure that there are some bones in there. In all likelihood it's an urn, as there appears to be some ashes." I was naturally taken aback, and then I asked, "Did you find any others down there?" I knew that this could only halt the progress of construction, and that would be a big problem. "We only found this urn," he replied. That relieved me. Judging by the look of the urn, it was really old. So that made me think that we weren't looking at some kind of unsolved crime or anything. Uncovering something like that in disused land didn't seem that groundbreaking. To be honest, getting rid of it was at the forefront of my mind. It was only going to push back progress. I needed this job to go well, as it was a great opportunity to get myself out there. If we had uncovered some ancient relics, some pieces of history, or dare I say more bones, then we would have stopped digging instantly. But for a one-off, I'm not sure it warrants it. Either way, I had to report my findings to the director. I told him my stance, and like me, he suggested that we move the urn and rebury it a good 10 meters away from our excavation site. We removed the urn, cleaned it, and reburied it. One of the workers suggested that we should light some incense sticks and lay some flowers. I said we didn't really have time for any of that. After that incident, construction progressed at a steady pace. We completed the ground floor before we knew it. But then, strange things began to happen. Accidents on the job became commonplace in certain areas. Workers lost fingers, broke bones, took heavy falls, and suffered lacerations. by building materials falling on them. In 1 month, our construction site suffered 11 injuries. Thankfully, none were fatal. It wasn't long before some of my colleagues on site started to wonder if it was all due to us moving those bones in the urn that we dug up. I would be lying to you if I told you that I didn't believe in that possibility. Word reached the director's ears, and all of a sudden we were told that we would have a day off. The site was covered in a blue kind of tarp so outsiders couldn't look inwards. I didn't put up a fuss. I had a paid day off, and the cherry on top would be news of no more work-related accidents. I'm not sure what he organized there, but our situation improved. When we went back to work, we found that the number of accidents had decreased, but they didn't go away. It was so weird that they seemed to happen in the same area of the site. I started to get concerned about what might happen in this building once construction was complete. I worried for the residents, which would come here to retire. A few days went by, and during that time I continued to think about the incidents. One evening I got a call from my colleague. He was the guy who had the bucket of the excavator drop on him, back when we were digging the foundations. When I heard it was him on the other end of the phone, I felt a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. He asked if we could meet, and I agreed. When I saw him, he looked pale. I asked him what happened. He said that he had been feeling off ever since the accidents started happening. I told him that it was natural and not to worry because the job would be over before he knew it. He said that he had been having trouble sleeping. I didn't start having the nightmares right away, but recently I've been having them every night. It's always the same dream too. Interesting, I thought. He elaborated on his recurrent dream. In my dream I see this man. He's the same one I saw at the construction site. You're in my dream too. The old man is always clinging to you, like he's always watching and waiting. He's attached to you. I found this amusing, so I said to him, "Why me?" "I don't know," he said back to me. I thought that he must be here for some kind of reason, so I waited for him to reveal it. And after a momentary pause, he came out with it. "Look, I came here tonight to see if we could, go back to the site and light a couple of incense sticks and maybe say a prayer." I guessed that my colleague was more religious than I thought. He had been in a pretty frightening accident too. I'm not cruel enough to shut down a request like that. If all it took from my part to end his bad dreams was another trip to site, then who was I to refuse? I decided that there was no time like the present, and I told him that if we left now, we could make it to site by about 6 p.m. It should be pretty quiet, and none of our colleagues would see us doing our kind of ritual thing. We set off, and in the car I asked him a little more about the old man in his dreams, and he told me about his appearance. From the way he described the man, he sounded an awful lot like the old man who asked me about construction on the first day I went to site. He was able to describe him very well, down to his haircut. He said that he could do it because he had seen the guy so many times. I started to get a little creeped out when he said that. I decided to change the subject. The atmosphere was getting a little heavy and oppressive. We arrived at site. It was almost completely constructed. We headed towards the corner we originally found the buried urn. It was going to be a bathroom on the first floor. As I stood in the near-complete bathroom, I couldn't help but think we should have left that urn where we found it. And while I was thinking those thoughts, I looked around the bathroom. Then from outside I heard my colleague call my name. I turned to leave, and I found myself stuck. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt something like sleep paralysis, yet I was still awake. Essentially, I couldn't move. I collapsed to the ground, and I couldn't find my feet again. As I hit the ground, a large stepladder began to topple. It fell and crashed onto my back. I was unable to get out of its path. Thankfully, it didn't hurt that much, but it really did startle me. At that point, my colleague came into the room and said to me, "Let's go light those incense sticks." I was able to get to my feet again, and I was ready to get out of that room. We burned our incense sticks, prayed, and left the scene. In the car on the way home, my colleague turned to me and said, "I'm sorry, you wouldn't have got hurt if I didn't ask you to come out to the site tonight." I told him not to worry. I found myself laughing and smiling about the situation before we even got back. My colleague brought the mood crashing down when he said that he believed that something was still angry at me. He urged me to stay away from the site. I listened. I managed to spend the rest of the job either stood outside or in my office looking at drawings and pictures. I didn't set foot inside that building again until it was complete. In total, there was 29 accidents on that site, and 28 came from the area we found the urn. That area is now a bathroom, and I wonder how many more accidents will occur there. I also wonder, what would happen if someone decides to build something next to the retirement home? Only those who worked on that construction site know about the urn. It was a weird experience, and I haven't been back to that place. This experience takes place a few years ago, and involves my former friend, Kanae, and her former lover. Hey, since it's Valentine's Day, why not, huh? Her boyfriend was a good-looking guy. He had a really good job in a big company, but the problem was, he was married with 2 kids. In other words, she was having an affair. But she was really happy with it. I guess she felt it was all fine. It was kind of awful, but she was sure she could steal him away from his family, or at least extort him. She hatched a plan. She wanted to engineer a situation where he broke up with his wife and left his family. Therefore, his adultery would remain a secret, and he wouldn't have to pay any alimony payments if they got divorced. You can probably understand why at this point I want to remind you that she is a former friend of mine. She was pretty open about the whole thing, and I think she held nothing back. She even showed me his wife online. She found her profile picture on Facebook or Instagram, I forget. She would constantly bring up his wife's profile on her phone whenever she saw me to seemingly mock her and attempt to belittle her. When I saw her photos, I wouldn't join in on the bashing. I mean, to me, she just looked like a bright and beautiful woman. Maybe she put her down to make herself feel better, or to make her feel a little more easy with what she was doing to their family. Kanae was too much. I was overwhelmed by her daily updates and the spewing of her bare desires. I would have tried harder to distance myself from her, but she was literally working in a building on the same street I was living on. She was running her own business, and I walked past her store every day to use the subway, so she was unavoidable. One day I was in the food court of the mall in our town with my daughter, and I noticed my friend's boyfriend and his family walk in. I knew them both instantly because of the way Kanae had been so eager to show me photos of them. They looked like a really nice family, like the kind you would see on the cereal boxes in days gone by. Everyone was smiling and enjoying their meals. It was awful being in the know. The father looked so nice and in love with his family. What a shame he was messing around on them. I was thinking of this while feeding my daughter her food. She knocked her soft toy off the edge of the table. I stooped to pick it up as quickly as I could, but a hand lay on top of the toy before my hand could reach it. Without meeting the eyes of the owner of that hand, I called out, "Oh, thank you." I rose up to my seated position and saw a smiling face with an arm outstretched, offering me the toy. She was beautiful and bright-looking. I knew that face. It was his wife, the woman I had seen in the photos online. My friend was having an affair with her husband, and she was right, here in front of me. I suddenly felt a sharp internal pain in my chest, the pang of knowing more than I should, of secondhand guilt or embarrassment perhaps. I pretended to be calm and reached out for my daughter's toy, and I thanked the woman. The woman replied with not, "You're welcome," but in a low and deliberate tone she warned, "Tell Kanae to watch out." I felt my blood run cold. How did she know? I was at a loss for words. She placed the stuffed toy back in my hand, but I felt something else drop onto my palm. She smiled and turned back to her table. Their family went on laughing and enjoying their day. Meanwhile, my palms were sweating and my heart was palpitating. I placed the stuffed toy back on the table and fearfully looked at what had been dropped on my palm. I saw a few neatly folded pieces of paper there. I was freaked out but also incredibly curious. I needed to know, so I quickly opened them. Written in small print was Kanae's address, phone number, educational background, work history, family names with their occupations and ages, phone numbers and addresses. There was also a list of Kanae's friends and all of their personal information. I started to shake when I saw my name there. My phone number, my family members' names, and my address. Well, it was the first time in my life when I heard my heart beat like that. I didn't tell Kanae about what happened. I was furious. She was bad news. I found out a little later that she sent my husband a couple of inappropriate messages too. So I was justified to get rid of her. It seems like Kanae and her affair was shut down pretty quick. She let me know that happened in one of the final meetings I had with her. He apparently was furious with the way she spoke about his wife. Not long after all this went down, I moved away, and of course I didn't bother telling Kanae where I moved to. I also blocked all incoming phone calls from her number. She was just bad news. There was a really scary experience in that food court, and I still have the piece of paper she handed me. I encountered something which I believe was demonic. It happened after I graduated from college. I attended a language school in New York. I made some great friends along the way. What surprised me when I was there was that everyone was so keen to help. They helped me move out of an apartment, saving me a lot of money. In return, I helped anyone from my class when they needed to move. On the day of my move, I rented a van. The area I was moving to was called Astoria in Queens. When I arrived at my new place, I opened the door and all I could smell was this earthy smell, like soil or dirt. I went and had a look around. I was feeling worried by my choice of apartment. It was a small one-bedroom. Basically, as soon as you came in through the door, you step up into the kitchen, and after you go through the kitchen, you come to the living room, and there's a door to the bedroom from there. By the time I got to my new bedroom, the earthy smell was gone. I felt good about the place. Every time I went back and forth to my bedroom, I sensed the presence of something in there. It sounds strange, but I was fixated on the wall in my bedroom. Something seemed to be there, something that I couldn't see. I decided to ignore it until I had finished moving in. When most of the work was done, someone had hooked up the TV and we were all watching a sports game for a while. I went back into my bedroom and I felt that strange uneasy feeling when I passed the wall. I looked at the wall for a while and there appeared to be some impressions in the paint or some faint outline of something presumably left by the former tenant. It was like some unbalanced plus sign. Part of the sign was longer than the other part. I asked one of my friends if he could see it, and he replied, "Isn't that an upside down cross?" Well, that really creeped me out. I could tell that my friend was a little spooked too. I asked him if he wanted to stay over, and he did. He stayed in my room on the fold-out bed. One other friend stayed in the living room. We had a bunch of drinks and a good laugh. My hellish experience started later that night. Since I was a little drunk, I thought I would get to sleep straight away, but I didn't. I was so worried about that inverted cross indented on the wall. I found it so hard to get to sleep. I got up at one point to use the bathroom, went back to bed, closed my eyes, and suddenly I was unable to move. Sleep paralysis. I heard the sound of footfall. I opened my eyes and I saw two big men walking towards me. This was my first time to experience sleep paralysis. I couldn't close my eyes, but I felt as if I was about to pass out. These two tall men were walking into the lounge. They stopped at the sofa and one of them bent down and muttered something into the friend's ear that was sleeping on the sofa. After about 2 minutes or so, the men then approached the bedroom. They stood at the foot of my bed and then walked up the side of my bed, by my head. They were chopping the air with their hands and chanting something in some ancient language I didn't understand. It was probably Latin. I didn't know how long this went on for. 10 minutes? Maybe even 30. I had no sense of time. I knew it must have been a long time because I can still remember the faces of those men clearly. I was reaching the limits of my sanity. I didn't know it was possible to feel that frightened. Then suddenly the chanting was over. I closed my eyes for a second, and when I opened them, the men were gone, and so was my sleep paralysis. I thought that whatever was happening to me was finally over, but then I was immediately unable to move again. The room filled with the stench of soil, that same earthy scent I smelled when I walked through the door earlier that day. Next I was struck with an awful feeling, the feeling of impending death racing towards me, creeping up on me. And that was when something flew to the ceiling. It looked demonic. Its body was covered in thick veins. It was a dark color, and only about 50 centimeters or just under 20 inches in length. I couldn't see it clearly. I couldn't bring myself to look at it for a long period of time. It was on the ceiling, hunched over like a cat does when it hisses. It was the color of a deep greeny blue, and I saw its yellow glowing eyes peered down at me, and then a voice boomed in my mind, which was not my inner thoughts.
You are not.
It then disappeared through the wall. As soon as it was gone, relief washed over me, and I felt safe. I was able to fall back asleep after a while. My body was so exhausted. In the morning, I asked my friend who slept on the sofa if he had a sound night of sleep, and if he had any dreams. I was really annoyed to find out that him and the friend who slept in my room both didn't have any bad dreams. I told them about my experience and they were interested. We decided to go to the real estate agent at around noon. I asked the real estate agent to put me in touch with the owner. He did, and I found out that the owner was happy to talk to me about the building's history. I think he did this because he wanted to reassure me and keep me living there, but it kind of backfired on him. I told him about my experience, and he just laughed and said, "That kind of shit just can't happen." I was all like, that kind of shit did happen, man. Then, in an attempt to prove me wrong, he whipped out a ledger, which documented tenants going back over the last 40 years. We went over the years in the ledger until the landlord stopped on a page. The year was 1979. There was just one word underlined against a tenant's name, and that word was evil. Then, as if it had all come back to him, he told us about the tenant. He said in the 70s in America there was a boom in Satanism and an interest in the occult. He believed that the man who lived in my apartment was a practicing Satanist. He didn't make much of it, because he didn't care as long as the bills were paid. And they were. He didn't really apologize, and I can't blame him. I then asked the real estate agent to get me a new place ASAP, and it got sorted pretty quickly. I didn't have to pay any fees or anything like that, and with the help of my friends once again, I moved into somewhere a little less frightening. Anyway, my experience taught me to believe in the paranormal. Who knows, maybe there are demons and devils out there. Well, I think one's out there, in Astoria, New York. I wish I could tell you more about the building I lived in, but I can't remember it very well, for better or for worse. It's in Astoria, a couple of minutes away from a famous 24-hour restaurant. I work for an apartment management company, kind of like real estate. I've been working here for a long time. I'm sure if you ask a lot of people in my line of work, you would likely find some with strange and creepy stories to tell. The company I work for owns about 12 buildings, and I manage them pretty much single-handedly. The way the company operates is by buying up properties on the market whenever they're cheap. This means the buildings we get aren't ever of the highest quality, and there's always a lot of work to do to get them up to scratch. I want to tell you about one of these properties. It's an apartment block and it's about 25 years old. We've been the owners of it for about 3 years now. The apartments in the building were all single apartments. Usually, our company would compete with others and attempt to outbid one another when it came to this building. But there wasn't any interest from any rival companies. When I looked over the tenancy agreements for the current residents, I got confused. It was as if every contract was different, and the rent payment plans were all over the place. It didn't seem normal at all, but having paying residents was a pretty good situation to be in. I guess it's kind of rare in auctions. There were 3 vacant apartments too, so there was money to be made. 2 had been empty for less than 6 months, but 1 apartment had been unlived in for much longer, and that was apartment 401. I found this strange because 401 was a corner apartment and should have gotten some good sunlight. I went to check out the building. 401 seemed to be the oldest looking apartment. It was really dated compared to the other 2 apartments. It hadn't been renovated, and I didn't know why. I guess since the building owner was selling up, he must have had some money issues and never got round to updating that 1 apartment. 401 was a pretty standard-looking single apartment. The window was to the right, and the veranda was at the back. It had a small chest of drawers, a closet, 2 TVs, and various storage boxes. In the walk-in wardrobe, there was some bedding and a whole bunch of small items. Frankly, it was a bit of a mess in there. It looked as if someone left in a hurry. So I was in 401, trying to tidy it up. I was throwing things out. I wouldn't usually be cleaning up alone, but I was eager to get some photos of the dimensions and current state of the place. I'm a person who never really picks up on any kind of vibes. I've never had a paranormal encounter or anything like that, but when I was in that room, I felt as if someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it, but as evening slowly grew into night, I couldn't escape that feeling. I felt so uncomfortable when I suddenly smelled the scent of something unusual. It was as if I had just walked into someone else's house. You know, like each house gives off a certain kind of smell or scent perhaps? It was like that, the scent of life, in a long, dormant shell of a home. It was chilling. There was a full-length mirror hanging from the wall, and I found myself constantly looking up at it. The mirror was attached to the wall, and it seemed as if it would take some doing to get it off. I didn't want to look at the mirror anymore, so I shifted and faced away from it while I continued working. After things were slightly tidied up, I measured for a floor plan, and I snapped a few photos, and I headed back to the office. I decided to get in touch with a firm we use for renovations and ask for a contractor to take a look at the photos I took. A few days later, I got a call from the renovation company, and we got them to give 401 a fresh look. During the first day of work taking place, I got a call from the renovators, and it went a little like this. Hi. It's kind of hard to describe, but there's something in this apartment. What are you talking about? What? Wood rot? No, it's not that. It's just me and the contractor are now in the apartment, and it's, well, actually, you better probably come down here if you can. Well, I headed down there to see what all the fuss was about, and the two renovators led me to the full-length mirror. Would you mind taking a look behind the mirror? We've pried it away from the wall and, thought you should see this. I looked back there. It was black with soot, but I could see something else. All these strange religious talismans and cryptic symbols. Something wasn't right there. In my line of work, you have to expect unpleasant surprises from residents. Accidents, pretty much anything can happen. But when you see something like that, some kind of religious or cult stuff, well, for me, it just plain spooks me out. In addition to these weird things being found behind the mirror, one of the renovators complained of having a splitting headache and he had to go home. I asked the other guy what he thought of the place and if he was alright. He said to me, "Off the record, I've been on plenty of jobs, but none have weirded me out as much as this one. Something about that mirror, man. I don't like it, and I don't scare too easy." Well, we pushed on with the renovations. Actually, I had a Buddhist friend come and purify the place, just in case. When the renovations were complete, the search for a tenant quickly began. After about a month, a suitable tenant was found. I set the rent a little lower to entice someone in. The tenant was a woman in her 50s, a great candidate. She had been hospitalized for some time and she needed a place to recuperate, so I figured she was ideal. I'll put it another way, I wasn't worried about noise complaints. She was very pleasant and soft-spoken. Things seemed fine, and after a while I kind of forgot about apartment 401. But about a week or so after her move-in day, I got a noise complaint call from apartment 402. The resident said that the woman in apartment 401 was screaming at night, incomprehensible words while hitting the walls and throwing things around. I couldn't really believe that could be true, so I decided to stop by and ask some of the tenants on her floor how things were going, just in case they wanted to mention anything. They didn't need much encouragement. They told me all about their new neighbor. They said that she would burst out of her apartment and into the hallway at night. One told me some of the phrases she heard her shouting as she passed through the hall. "The man is watching me from the ceiling, through the gaps in the ceiling. Someone keeps bringing home women at night. This guy's either horny all the time or I'm living in a goddamn red light district. He's not gonna coerce me. No." From what I heard that day, the police had been out several times too because she had been shouting this kind of nonsense from the veranda late at night. I knocked on the door of apartment 401. The tenant answered the door. To me, she looked entirely different. She had a discerning glare as she opened the door, completely eagle-eyed. She started the conversation with, "I can't sleep at night. Someone's watching me from the ceiling. It's like I'm under constant surveillance. Someone is watching me from dusk till dawn." I went inside to see what she was talking about, and there was a hole in the ceiling of about 30 centimeters. I couldn't be certain that she made the hole, or if indeed some other mysterious voyeur did. I decided to offer her out of her tenancy lease, for the good of the building, an offer she happily and readily accepted. I had to consider her welfare since she hadn't long been discharged from hospital. After she moved out, I hired the same contractor to help repair that hole in the ceiling. I got a call from him shortly after he arrived at the apartment. He said that he had found more of those strange pieces of paper with symbols up there. I said to him, "Just fix the hole for now, and I'll take a look at the other stuff later." I told myself that the incident with the former tenant was just a one-off. I mean, she did just come out of the hospital. The next tenant was a guy. He was in his late 20s. He had a decent job and his parents signed on as guarantors, so everything seemed fine for me. He looked like a decent enough chap too. I greeted him and his dad on moving day and they seemed perfectly pleasant. 3 months or so went by and I got a call from my new tenant's dad asking if I had heard from his son. I said that I hadn't, and he told me that he hasn't been able to get in touch with his son for about a week. He wanted me to go to 401 with the keys to do a welfare check with him right away. I realized that the rent hadn't been paid as well. Both his parents arrived and informed me that their son had been missing from work without notice too. I started to get worried and began to think the worst. We arrived at 401 and I pressed the doorbell. Unsurprisingly, there was no response. I then opened the door with the duplicate key we retained. I pushed open the door, but it snapped against the chain. It was open enough to pour out a horrendous smell, though. The stench was so terrible that it caused me to almost throw up in front of the parents. I covered my mouth and tried to look in through the door. It was pitch black in there, but I could make out the shape of what I thought was a garbage bag. I called out the tenant's name. No reply. His mother called out. I could hear the sense of pain and worry in her voice. No reply. I realized during the intervals we expected a response to come in that I could faintly hear the sound of the TV inside the room. I told his frightened parents that I had a chain-cutting tool in my car and I would go and get him. I came back and I told them that I was happy to enter the room ahead of them. I was still thinking the worst, and I cannot imagine the pain it would have caused them to see their lifeless son in that apartment. I cut the chain and I headed in. It was dark in there, and there was garbage all over the place. I tried the lights, but they didn't come on. The main room was almost completely dark except for the TV. I called out once again while looking around the room. Then my eyes fell on him. He was there, sat at the edge of his bed, with the duvet wrapped around him. I shouted out in shock, and his parents came rushing in. They called out to him, asking if he was okay, but he didn't respond. He just hung his head. His hair was long, and he hadn't shaved. He looked almost unrecognizable to the person who moved in 3 months ago. I looked up at the ceiling. With the help of the glow of the TV, I noticed that there were black garbage bags taped to the ceiling. I opened the curtains to see that he had done the same to the windows and the veranda doors too. This was very unusual, and it was freaking me out. I called an ambulance and went about removing the bags, as they could be a hazard. The ambulance arrived and the parents and the son all went off to the hospital. I think they were all crying by the time they left. A few days later, the tenant's mum came and told me that they were taking their son back to the countryside to recuperate. She said that she wanted to cancel the contract for apartment 401. And who was I to say no to that? I mean, I could have dug my heels in, but I like to think I have a little more decency than that. I wanted to ask how he was doing, but I just didn't feel it was right to pry. It's been about 2 years since he moved out, and we aren't offering that apartment out to tenants at the moment. To be honest, I would be happy if no one lived in there ever again. We've had a lot of questions by the police, acquaintances, etc. It seems as if apartment 401 has earned itself a little infamy. Even the residents in the building won't go near it. One last thing. On the day I went to take the photos of the place, I found one photo on my digital camera that I don't remember taking. The camera is just pointing towards the ceiling, towards the part where the hole was made. I want to know about the history of that building and that apartment because the first resident's comments intrigued me. What I thought at the time was incoherent babble might hold some clues to the mystery of apartment 401. Especially the comment about the man bringing back women to the room and her saying that he was going to coerce her. I wonder what she was referring to. I wonder what stories the mirror and the walls would tell if they could. Last August, 2 friends and I rented a trailer because I recently purchased an aluminium boat. We decided to load it up and go bass fishing. The plan was to go for 4 days and stay in an inn near the lake. Since the day before we arrived, it had been raining heavily, and it showed no signs of letting up. When we got there, we took a look at the lake. The water looked incredibly muddy. We took our boat out. We were fishing in the western part of the lake, and we caught nothing that day. So on the second day, we tried a different place, a more central location. But it didn't get any better for us. It was like we were fishing in a ditch. There was no sign of life in the water. The rain continued to fall. It was cold, but we didn't give up. We kept on fishing, and finally, we caught a decent amount. Then in the evening, when it was darker, it all changed. I looked up, and I saw a person stood out there in the middle of the lake. The person was about 200 meters away from me. It was dim and gloomy, but I could make out the silhouette of a person. My skin was cold, despite there being no breeze. The person didn't look as if they were fishing. I could see no pole or nets. They appeared to be standing still, like a statue. It was weird. I turned to my friend and told him to look and see what I was seeing. I said that it was creepy. He agreed, and we decided that we would stay away from that guy. We started the motor and began to pull away when my other friend, who had been sat down the whole time, shouted and started pointing out at the water. We looked in the direction he was pointing. The guy from before, out in the water, was now visible. I could see that he was wearing what looked like a grey boiler suit. He was slowly being submerged into the water, like he was sinking into a bog or quicksand. He wasn't fighting it. I was worried that he was here to take his own life, and then I thought that perhaps he had unintentionally got stuck. We needed to go and help him. I had all these thoughts swirling around my head as I watched the man sink into the water. We sped up to get to him as fast as we could, and we approached him. And as we approached him, I noticed that the water was now up to the man's armpits. The man in the boiler suit was now about 50 meters away. He had his back to us. We called out to him. It was really stressful because he wasn't responding. We were screaming at him, and there was no reaction coming from him. Was it really that deep out here? I wondered. Then as we got closer, the propeller of our boat started making a crazy sound, and shortly after, the engine stopped completely. It turns out we had hit the bottom of the lake. I could see the bottom. We managed to back out and get the motor started. We set it to its lowest setting to navigate back into slightly deeper water, and then we were able to get to the place we saw the man sinking. "Wait, stop!" my friend called out. "What?" "We should turn back. Something's wrong here," he said. He looked back at us from the front of the boat, and it was as if all the color had drained from his face. And we realized that the man in the grey boiler suit had completely vanished. "Yeah, we should go," said my other friend. This is the part in the horror films where the boat's engine stops working, right? Well, that was exactly what happened to us. It was the weirdest thing. The engine just stopped completely. It didn't splutter to a halt. It just stopped. I looked around, and we were pretty much in the exact spot where we saw the man in the boiler suit. I could see beyond the surface of the water. I could see the riverbed. He really wasn't there. He disappeared. I got chills. I didn't want to keep looking into the water. It really freaked me out. I didn't want to look around me. I really didn't want to see him again. I couldn't explain what had just happened, and it really frightened me. My friend grabbed an oar and pushed against the bottom of the lake to get us moving again. The oar was almost snatched out of his hands by the thick mud below. When we got back into deeper water, I prepared to try the engine again. As soon as I couldn't see the bottom of the lake, I tried the engine. It wouldn't start. I pleaded internally as I kept trying and trying to get the engine to work. I pulled the starter repeatedly with all my might, and then it finally started. "Let's get off of this fucking lake, boys," one of my friends exclaimed. We had to circle back around close to where we saw the boiler suit man. Without saying anything to each other, we all stared in that direction, through the drizzling rain, to see if he would appear again. But thankfully he didn't. We sped off back to the shore, and we didn't look back. When I saw my car parked up at the shore, I was relieved. I knew I was nearly off the lake. It really was a frightening experience. You all saw that too, right? He was there, he was drowning, and then he needed our help, and then he disappeared. How does that happen? I asked. We could see the bottom of the river. There was nowhere he could have actually gone to. That wasn't a human. We were jabbering on about what had just happened. It really had shaken us up. But eventually our rate of speech slowed, and we calmed a little. We noticed that the height of the water had decreased quite a bit since the morning, so it was time to take the boat back in for the day. I tried to not look at the lake, especially in the area we saw the boiler suit man. We pulled the boat up onto the banks of the shore so it wouldn't drift away, while we hurriedly unpacked our gear. Our fishing tackle boxes were stacked on top of one another, and then suddenly there was a huge thud. One of the tackle boxes went flying towards the boat, as if it had been hurled at it. We all screamed and shouted. One of my friends told the other to hurry up and grab his tackle box so we could get out of the area. It was in nearly 2 pieces. There was a huge crack running down the center of it. We were all stunned into silence. We didn't say a word after that. And I had a terrifying feeling that something else was about to happen. Maybe we were all thinking the same thing. We grabbed all the things we could and threw them in the back of my car. What the hell was going on? What did we do wrong? Why us? I asked myself these unanswerable questions. If we did something wrong to someone or to something, please forgive us, I was thinking, and even asking, but it didn't work. I went to raise the boat out of the lake. The idea was to tie it to the back of the car and pull it out. I started back towards the boat, and then I stopped in my tracks. I saw that man in the boiler suit stood next to the boat. His clothes were soaked. It was as if he had just emerged from the water. He was moving in the strangest manner. I don't know if I actually heard this, but I really feel as if I did. I heard a voice which did not belong to either of my friends say,
"Don't need the boat anymore."
We ran to the car, and we all jumped in and sped away into the night. We drove for a long, long time, and then we found an all-night diner. We all ordered a beer and looked at each other nervously. It was a while before any of us spoke. "Man, leave that boat there. I can't go back," said one friend. "I'm sorry, but I agree. It's impossible for me to," said the other. That night, I slept with the TV on and the lights on. The next morning, my courage had returned, and I decided to go and get the boat back myself. It was in the same place as we left it. I saved a couple of packets of salt from the restaurant and sprinkled them in the boat, hoping to purify it. I didn't know much about the paranormal, but I had seen someone do this in a movie. I managed to get the boat back in the trailer, with no thanks from my friends, and I ended up selling it a while after. I don't want to say where I sold it, but I hope that the next owner doesn't have a similar encounter to ours. I needed to get rid of that boat, and I haven't returned to that lake. My best friend at school and I used to go over to one another's home often. His family was always really welcoming and nice to me. I was encouraged to turn up whenever I felt like. On occasion I would turn up and my friend wouldn't be there, but his mum would be like, "Oh hey, come in, it's so great to see you. Why don't you hang out here for a bit? I have to do a little bit of shopping, so you can keep an eye on the place, snacks in the fridge." My friend's mum and my mum were very close, and we had a great relationship between our families. I would often stay home for her if no one was home. This experience takes place when I was asked by my mum to go over to my friend's house with some vegetables our grandmother grew in her garden. It was about lunchtime when I headed over. I pressed the bell for their home, but no one came to the door. I guessed that no one was in. That was fine because I was entrusted with the location of their spare key. They hid it in case of emergencies. On times like this when they were out, and I was sent to return something, I knew to just leave it in their living room, on the table, and lock up and return the key to where I found it. It was pretty routine. So I took the key out and I unlocked the door and I headed inside. As soon as I got inside, I sensed the presence of someone in the house with me. I instantly knew that someone was upstairs. I don't know, I guess I heard a noise or something. I thought, this is out of the ordinary. Someone should be down here. It was a Sunday after all. I guessed that my friend or his mum was upstairs, perhaps ill, and then I managed to somehow convince myself that one of them had collapsed or something. So I set the bag of vegetables down in the entryway and I headed upstairs. I thought that there could be a thief or intruder up there, so just in case, I did my best attempt of being one with the shadows. In my mind, I moved as silently as a ninja. I was a kid, lay off, I had a great imagination. Let me just explain the upstairs floor plan. If you go upstairs, from the back there is a storage room, my friend's room and the toilet, and then my mum's friend's room. If you were to crane your head from the top of the stairs, you'd pretty much see and hear anything that's going on up there. When I stealthily got to the top of the stairs, I didn't look because I heard something strange. It's like a kind of sound. Maybe it was an air leak. Like the sound of a tire being deflated, maybe? It was really weird. I heard the sound then travel across the hall towards my friend's room. I thought, oh man, there's something weird going on here. I don't think that's my friend or his mum making that noise. I just climbed the rest of the stairs and I headed towards my friend's room. I was careless or brave, but it happened. I craned my head around the door frame and I saw a man in his room. He was spitting everywhere. And that was the source of the sound. It was incredibly gross. I was completely lost for words. It was like I was dreaming. He spun around and looked my way. He didn't seem all that surprised by my presence. He gave me a cheerful greeting. "Ah, hello." I felt awkward enough to respond. Hi." That's all I could muster up. I was still very confused. A few seconds or so go crawling by, and then I ask, "What are you doing here?" "Just keeping my ex in her place, showing her who's boss. This is how you do it." I looked around my friend's room, and his toys, his dresser, his chest of drawers, and his clothes in his wardrobe were covered in this man's spit. I was stunned. There was someone who was completely out of their mind stood in my friend's bedroom. A thought jumped into my mind. Get the police. I ran downstairs and grabbed my grandma's vegetables, and I ran to the police station. 3 officers accompanied me back to my friend's house. They headed upstairs, but they said that they couldn't find anyone in the house. What I should have done, and I've had a lot of time to think about this, is lock the guy in the house. But, like I said, I was pretty young. My friend and his mum, who had been out, arrived back to their home to be greeted by the flashing lights of a police car and officers holding notebooks. By the time they had heard my story and heard from the officers, they were both in tears. And it turns out that the man I had seen in my friend's bedroom spitting on everything was my friend's dad. Apparently he had been searching for my friend's home after he got divorced with his wife. I have never met someone with that much malice. I never thought an adult would do that to their own flesh and blood. Well, I wonder. My friend's mum said to her boy, "We'll throw everything out he spat on." My friend reacted at first with anger. He had to be restrained by an understanding officer. I helped calm him down, and I'm not ashamed to say that I had tears in my eyes. My family gave some money to my friend's mum. His dad even spat on his underwear. Can you believe that? We wanted to help, not pity. The money we gave was given out of love, not obligation. Righteousness, not sympathy. There are decent people out there in the world, and I personally would never let that piece of shit's actions cloud my impression of those who do good out there. This is why this story is so hard to share. There is no lesson. There is nothing to be garnered except from disappointment in the man who committed those foul deeds in his empty ex-wife's house. My dad and my bro took turns in picking my friend's mum up and him from work and school and dropping them off. I was too young for a license. The police let their intentions be known too. And my friend's dad never came back. This happened back in my college days. Graduation day would come in the following semester, and I had a lot of free time, and not so much money. One day I got bored of lazing around, so I went in search of a job, and I managed to get one, working as a handyman. Well, handyman apprentice might be a more accurate description. I was working with these 3 retired handymen, and when it was time for hard physical work, they left it to us hired uni students. The work wasn't constant, but I needed it, and I had the time. The next job was going to be clearing out a house and a pond somewhere deep in the countryside. It was expected to take 2 days to complete the job, and it was a high-paying job too. It didn't seem that difficult, so I jumped at the chance. I should have been skeptical. It was way too much money for the work they had requested, but nonetheless, I signed myself up, and I would be accompanied by one of the retired handymen, as well as a guy who would be kind of overseeing things like a foreman or something. We drove in a company vehicle with a wide back, like a shuttle bus or a big van. It took about 3 hours to get there. This took place at the end of August, by the way, while I was still on vacation from university. When we arrived at the location, I realized that it was in the middle of an abandoned village. Yet there seemed to be a few people living there. I've heard of villages slowly declining in numbers until the place basically becomes depopulated. There are numerous reasons why: aging population, lack of opportunities, etc. I don't want to say where it was because I don't think you'd want to go there by the time I get through with my story. Plus, there might be some other people living there that we didn't meet. The house we were going to be working on was on the crest of a hill. Seemed like this house would be owned by someone wealthy in time gone by, perhaps like a village elder, a wealthy farmer, or someone who had this passed down to them through inheritance. It was old, but amazingly big. It was a 1-story home with 20 rooms, a mansion. The garden was huge, but overran with weeds. We arrived at around 9 a.m., and we instantly got to work on the pond. The pond was long, and it curved around the outside of the house in an interesting pattern. I bet by the time we left it would be looking great, but that morning the water was green and murky. There would surely be nothing living in there in its current state. There's a drainage hole down there, and we got a pump in the van, but if we use it without raking the pond, it's likely to clog, so we can't have that. Rake it thoroughly first. The foreman told me. It made sense because if the pump bust, then we would waste time driving back to go get a new one. He handed me and the old man a couple of nets. We were told to fill some wooden boxes we brought with us in the van with whatever came out of the pond. And then we would take all that trash back with us. The foreman said that other boxes would be brought up to the house later that evening. I figured that whatever we pulled out of the water could rest on the riverbanks drying until the other boxes came. I didn't expect there to be much down there. Maybe some rocks and weeds and stuff like that. The old handyman and I split up and started sweeping the pond with our nets from opposite ends. When my net emerged, I saw pale shards of white bones. I guessed that the bones belonged to the animals that inhabited the nearby mountains. cats, small dogs, weasels, and other identifiable creatures. I'm not an expert, but you could tell by the shape of their skulls that they weren't human. I thought that this would be common for ponds which had been long left dormant, to be honest. I thought I would find bones. I just didn't expect to find as many as we did. There were ancient algae green bones coming up from the murky depths. I had no choice but to keep piling them up on the banks. It was hot that day. I was sweating profusely, and hauling bones out of a weed-filled pond is harder than it sounds, to be honest. I can't tell you how many animals were down there, but I wouldn't be surprised if the number was close to 100. By lunch, we had drained the pond to about the midway point. I could see the bottom when we used the pump to flow the water down the banks. The bottom was a dark shade of brown, and when the water settled, I saw even more bones down there. They were bigger bones now, as well as the small ones that we had been hauling. When we got back to work, after a while, another van arrived with more of those wooden boxes the foreman promised us. By the time the bones were all loaded into those boxes, the sun was beginning to set. It's funny, I swear that some of those bones looked human-like in the dark. The skulls not too much, too small, too misshapen. We knew we would be spending the night there, but I didn't expect to be staying in the mansion. We were given dinner. It was nicer than the lunch. All three of us would be staying in a room on the ground floor next to the pond and the garden. The room hadn't been cleaned, there was dust everywhere. I spent a while wiping a human-sized shape out of the dust so that I would have somewhere to sleep. There were no futons. We were given blankets as thin as towels and nothing more. Thankfully, it wasn't cold that night. In fact, we needed to open the shutters and the sliding door to the garden to get airflow. There were at least metal coils, which, when lit, repelled mosquitoes. Can't stand mosquitoes. We had light, but no TV or radio. I just chatted with the old men, and they shared their whiskey with me. I think I fell asleep around 10 p.m. I was completely exhausted. I'm glad I was exhausted, because getting to sleep on that rotten flooring would have been impossible otherwise. I had been on a few jobs like this, like I said at the start, and this one was the strangest so far. As soon as the lights were off in the room, I heard a weird noise. It was a kind of strange crying sound. It came from upstairs. The mansion was big, but there was only one floor above us, and that noise came from up there. I thought perhaps I was hearing things, but one of the others said out loud, "The fuck is that?" "It's just the house settling, maybe an animal on the roof or something," the foreman attempted to answer. "I don't think that's the house settling, there's no wind, it's hot. It seems a bit too hot out for cats to be running around too, you know what I mean? Maybe it's something bigger from the mountains, something else, you know?" The old man said. "I don't like it. Sounded like a baby crying to me. It's creepy," I added. I remember that conversation so clearly. The sound stopped after about 5 minutes, and not long after that, I fell asleep. I awoke a few hours later to the frightened screams of one of my companions. The lights came on and I was temporarily blinded. I asked what was going on, scared. "Something just touched my face," the old man shouted. "It was small and soft. Was it one of you? It felt like flesh." The foreman quickly responded with irritation. "You guys left the door open, so any animal could have gotten in or something." "I can't see any animals," I said. "It wasn't an animal. Well, I don't know. Maybe. Well, I don't think so," the old man replied. We looked around the room and saw nothing. The silence wasn't comfortable. I was reminded of the strange crying sound we had heard on the floor above us earlier. If an animal came in, it must have quickly got out. Or maybe the old man just had a nightmare. I checked my watch, and it was 4 a.m. There would be time to think about theories in the morning, so I said, "Look, it's almost dawn now, it's not that hot, let's just shut all the doors and just get some shut-eye." No one objected. So once the doors were shut, I went back to sleep. When I woke up again, it was 8 a.m. The other two were up, and they were looking out at the pond from the porch outside. The water in the pond was about a third full, and there was another old man approaching the pond from the van carrying a wooden box. In the box was a golden statue. He pointed at the bottom of the pond, and the two old men I was with nodded. I didn't know what the hell was going on, so I went outside to take a look. I wondered what we would need a statue for. I looked at the bottom of the pond and it looked different. There were 3 of these statues in the bottom of the pond, evenly spaced out. They looked about 15 centimeters in size. The retired handyman said to me, "Look at that." He pointed down there. I saw footprints at the bottom of the pond, what appeared to be fresh footprints in the mud. The footprints were small, but human, like those of a child or a baby. We had our breakfast. I was really looking forward to getting the hell out of there. I asked what we would be doing that day, thinking that we would be finishing the pond, but I was surprised to hear that we would be working in the mansion. Well, at least it wouldn't be as hot. That crying sound wouldn't leave my mind, though. I thought that we would be cleaning the whole place from top to bottom, but we found out that there were rooms that we were forbidden from entering. This is where things get weirder and weirder for me. I was handed a dust cloth and a bucket and told that when the dust cloth was unusable, throw it away. And I was only to use water from the pond to clean the house with. I did as I was told. I wanted to be able to leave and get my money. Something was very strange here, and I told myself that if I complied, I wouldn't have to spend another night here. The dust in the rooms was so thick that it didn't take long before the cloth was black with dust, which in turn turned the dirty pond water a shade of black which light couldn't pass through. Again, we stopped for lunch, and then I deemed the cloth unusable by about 3 p.m. In that moment, the work halted. We all piled back into the minivans and hit the road. We all got back home at around 6 p.m. and the foreman turned to us outside the van and said, "You know what? You did some great work up there. Really good stuff, so there's a little extra in there for you." I was really pleased with that. I opened up the envelope he handed me, and I was shocked by the amount. It was more than I would have guessed. It was about $420 US. It was quite exhausting work, but for a student a few years back, yeah, that money went a long way. We all decided to finish off the evening with a meal in a moderately priced family restaurant. Since I had just been paid, I decided to get a steak. It had been a long time. We talked about all kinds of things, and eventually we landed on the subject of the crying thing we heard that night. The old man quietly said, "Call me crazy, but I swear, it was a baby we heard, and a baby touched me that night." "What makes you say that?" I asked. "Well, I know it wasn't an animal." "Why couldn't it be an animal?" the foreman asked. "Because animals usually have hair. The skin of that thing that touched me was smooth, and it smelled like milk and soap." We were silent for a while. "It was weird washing that pond out too. Why were there so many animal bones in it? And, I looked at some of those bones and I had to ask myself, could they not belong to humans? I really wondered. What's with the statues in the bottom of the pond too? It's just all so weird," the old man said. We sat there for a while, conjuring up theories, but we couldn't put a decent thread together and land on anything definite. I know it has something to do with a baby, though. I don't know if this is related, but I want to share it. After I graduated, I went to the USA. I was working illegally on a tourist visa for a while because I couldn't find much work. I couldn't get a woman over there. It was rough, I have to say. But I did meet a girl after a long time of waiting, and I had no intentions of getting married, and I'm sure that the feeling was mutual. Even though she was on birth control, we ended up getting pregnant. But sadly, we lost the child. We broke up a few months later, and I headed back to Japan. I got a job. I enjoyed some moderate success, and I lived a steady life. I met another woman, and we did get married. I got her pregnant twice, in fact, but we lost both. I've seen many specialists. There doesn't seem to be a good reason why it's happening. Sometimes I think back to that job in the abandoned village, and I wonder if it's related. I wonder how the foreman and the old handyman's doing too. I wonder how much that job has really cost me. This happened yesterday. I work in the restaurant industry, and I don't usually get to finish work until the morning hours. I was walking home at about 1:30 a.m., and this is where my creepy experience begins. I use a shortcut to get home. I go through a train station. It's open 24 hours. It was in this train station that I saw the old lady. She was sat on a bench. She looked to be between her 50s and her 60s. She was drinking some bottled tea. I didn't give her much thought because there are usually people sat like that, but as I got closer, I noticed that she was staring at me. It was more like a glare, to be honest. It wasn't friendly at all. She was glaring at me whilst drinking her tea. It was like she was going to down it all. I didn't like that look she was giving me, so I sped up my pace to move past the benches she was sitting on. As I was about to pass, I saw her stand up, and she began to follow me. I thought that I'd slow down and let her pass me by. I didn't like the idea of her following me. But then I thought, am I being too self-conscious? In the light of day, she's just an old woman walking on the same street as you, I told myself. It's only the darkness of night that makes this scenario a creepy one. The thing is, she didn't try to overtake me. She dropped her pace to maintain her position behind me. Something else was odd too. I could now hear this strange biting/chewing sound. It sounded like she was gnawing on her drinks bottle. Okay, I'm not being too self-conscious, I told myself. She's a freaking weirdo. I knew that there would be an all-night convenience store up ahead. So all I had to do was endure her creepiness until I got there. I kept my pace the same, but also prepared myself for some running if it was necessary. When I was getting closer to the convenience store, I guess about 3 minutes away, the old lady upped her pace behind me. I sprinted to the convenience store. I was relieved to be somewhere bright and safe. I turned to see if the old lady was still following me, and I was shocked to see her enter the store too. I was beginning to panic a little. I thought about calling the police, but then the old woman came and spoke to me. "Hey, you okay?" I was about to say something like, "Hey, if I look upset, then it's your fault. Why are you following me?" But she continued to speak. She said that someone else had been following me, and this person was right behind me as I entered the convenience store. But when I started running, the old lady couldn't keep up. She said that the other woman who was following me was wearing white and black, and she must have stopped following me as I entered the store. This is really weird because I remember looking over my shoulder several times and I didn't see a woman dressed in white and black clothes. I didn't know if I could trust what the old lady was saying. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want any more drama, so I just thanked the old lady for intervening and went home as quickly as I could. I took off my clothes and got ready for a shower, and my spine froze. There was about 10 strands of long hair on the back of my shirt. I didn't know where these strands had come from. I live alone and I don't work with anyone with hair that long. Of course, it wasn't my hair either. I felt so creeped out by the night's events, I threw those clothes away. And I had a real hard time sleeping. I just couldn't make sense of any of it. I kept thinking that either the old lady or the mysterious woman in black and white were following me, and they might know where I live now. I really want to move soon. I was told this story by an acquaintance. This happened while he was working in Tokyo. He was working later than usual since it was the end of the financial year, and a lot of different departments were staying on late, including his. And because his company had managed to get everything in order, his boss decided to take the team out for some drinks. After getting suitably drunk, he was only just able to make it in time for the last train home of the night. The only issue was that it stopped a few stations away from his home. The following happened as he was on his tipsy way home. It was a quiet night, and there was a pleasant breeze in the air. Although it would usually only take about 10 minutes to get home from the station, he said that he needed to find a bathroom, so he walked through the local park. He said that as soon as he entered the park, he heard something. A muffled, sobbing sound. The sound of a woman crying. In the park, opposite to the toilets, is a row of benches. My friend knew that he would likely have to pass by whoever was sobbing to use the facilities. As he drew closer, his eyes could confirm what his ears had told him. She had her head in her hands, and she was gently rocking back and forth. He said that he was worried about the woman, but first things first, he needed to use the bathroom, and fast. While he was washing his hands, he said that he could hear her sobbing on one of those benches. Now, my friend was not the type to be overly sympathetic, but he said that he stopped and was a little concerned for her. He called out from afar and asked her what the matter was. Then, when she offered no response, he approached her. "Are you okay?" he called out in a soft voice as he edged closer. At the very moment he did this, the woman shot to her feet and produced a sharp blade she had hidden. She held it overhand and started screaming and walking towards him. He said that she screamed the word chest and began to run at him. She was smiling at him. As she charged towards him, the knife slashed within a hair's breadth of him. Without thought, he struck a defensive blow to the crazed woman. His years of karate lessons had served him well. He was able to get her on the floor and get a safe distance away. She scrambled to her feet, then ran for it without looking back. My friend was able to get home safely. A couple of days later, he got a newspaper on the way to work and read a story about a woman who tried to attack other pedestrians. The incident was described as a thrill killing. He said he knew it was her before he saw her mugshot, but when he saw her smiling like she did before she lunged at him with that kitchen knife, he got goosebumps.